get going. Hour number 3. We're going to learn a lot this hour. I am really looking forward to this. This is another enormous assassination in American history. I'll speak for myself. I'll let Peter Robbins, our guest here, speak for himself. But the murder of James Forrestal was darn near as big as John Kennedy. Although at the time it was called a suicide. But in reality, this man was our first real Secretary of Defense, World War II hero, one of the brightest minds ever to come out of the military, and then some. He worked with so many people, even Admiral Byrd with Operation High Jump, that mysterious task force that was sent down to the South Pole and quickly apparently had its butt kicked and left. This is a huge story. James Forrestal, it is suggested, and I won't again speak for Peter, but wanted to tell the truth, felt that the American people deserved to know the truth. And some suggest that's what finally did him in. We don't know, but this is a very brave man, and I don't know enough about him. I feel a little bit remiss about that. There's a new documentary coming out that Peter Robbins has written and produced. It's coming soon, and I can't wait to see it. America's first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, murdered for apparently wanting to tell the American people the truth. This is a huge event that goes virtually unnoticed. Peter, welcome back to the program. It's been a long number of years. I'm glad to have you back.
It has indeed, and it's great to be back, Jeff.
Thank you very much for that. I want to tell you that when I first heard from Frank Chili, and thank you, Frank, for doing all you do for this program, that you had done a documentary, and I heard about it when you were still, I guess, in post-production or something, on James Forrestal. It amazes me that he was still sitting around waiting for his turn to have a documentary made about him. This is such a big story. You must have at one point said, my God, am I lucky? No one else has done this. When did it get to you that you needed to do this? How did it come about?
It kind of crept up, Jeff. I, like so many Americans, even informed Americans, I don't think I had ever heard anything about Mr. Forrestal, except a vague memory that there was a carrier that had his name. In fact, our first nuclear carrier launched in 1956, USS Forrestal. This goes back more than 30 years. It was 1987, and I was attending a International MUFON Symposium. Being 87, it was the 40th anniversary of our modern age of UFOs, in so many words, and it was a particularly compelling conference. It was in Washington, D.C., and I had heard, my dear friend, mentor, and recently lost Stanton T. Friedman, speak for the first time in 1978 at the United Nations. In fact, along with Dr. Hynek and Dr. Vallée and one or two other noteworthy personalities. I heard him speak a few times more, but in 87, he gave a talk that was somewhat life-changing for me. It was called The Secret Life of Donald K. Menzel. Many of your listeners know Dr. Menzel's name. He was the head of astronomy studies at Harvard, a respected academic. But in fact, Stan, through dint of extraordinary research, established beyond any doubt that he had lived a secret life for 30 years, while moving from being this respected academic to being America's first mainstream UFO debunker, and in fact was the mentor to the late Philip Klass, a name that listeners know. I sat pretty enwrapped, and I heard the talk, and at the time I was about 10 years into the work. I had spoken at a few conferences, written some articles. Most people knew me as Bud Hopkins' assistant, my dear friend of 35 years, who I worked for about half that time.
Oh, you're lucky.
I came away from the talk, Jeff, thinking,
Peter,
that's what I want to do.
Let me say one thing.
Yeah.
You just mentioned two names of two of the most remarkable people that I have ever known in this field.
You and me both, brother.
Stan, and so many times I had Stanton on, and Bud, another one. Just wow, you were graced. Go ahead, please. I didn't mean to interrupt, but
and please jump in any time. Our time together is going to go very quickly, even though it may seem long to some folks. And I went home after that weekend, and I had dinner with my folks shortly after, quite fired up. It was also within a few months of the so-called Eisenhower briefing document, which brought the term MJ-12 into the lexicon, becoming public. And many ufologists and historians have been arguing about it ever since. There are hundreds of documents purporting to be MJ-12. I can't speak for their validity. Some of them are intriguing in that if they are fake, they're brilliant fakes. But I am, like Stan, convinced that that original 8-page briefing document and the 1-page letter from September of 1947, eyes only, from Truman to Forrestal, to begin work on what they had discussed, are fully authentic. And I sat with my mom, we were having a drink, and I said, I want to do a serious research project, and I've got it down to a few people. Dr. Vannevar Bush, a subject we could discuss all week, was a finalist for me also. And my mom thought about it for a moment. She said, do Forrestal. I said, well, why? She said, number one, you cannot imagine how so many of us, my mom talking about high school memories, looked up to him during the war, and how devastated we were when we learned that he had committed suicide. In fact, it was the closest experience I had as a young person to what you remember as a boy, devastating you with John Kennedy's murder.
Yeah.
And I have to say, he was very charismatic, and I had a crush on him. And I thought, well, that's it. My mother had a crush on James Forrestal. Here I go. The irony is that right about that time, I was beginning to work in earnest on a book that put me in the map and then imploded on me several years ago, Left at Eastgate, a book about the Rendlesham Forest incident.
Yeah.
And I kind of shelved Forrestal for a few years. Came back to it. This is still pre-digital times. Started to do my work at the main branch of the New York City Public Library, printing out microfiche pages and starting to buy out-of-print memoirs as I do. And I gave my first talk on him in 2004. And every few years I came back. Different talks, articles. Finally, about 2 years ago, as I had moved into the realm of becoming my dad, who passed last year, full-time caregiver, and trying to pick up the pieces of my career, I thought, I want to find a new way to approach the general subject of UFO studies, but how do I break out of the audience that my colleagues and I are inevitably always going to speak to? Let's face it, the great majority of people who will show up for UFO talk are already interested in it. And it's gratifying to have a good response from an audience after you've done your due diligence. But I thought there must be another way to widen that audience. I have a extensive background in theater. I'm very proud to have worked with a number of Academy Award winners and Tony Award winners off Broadway for many years in a managerial position. I love
this is all coming back to me now from our earlier conversations. Now I remember. And
I thought about the wonderful world of theater audiences. Whether or not it's a small regional company and the audience is composed of folks with, high school educations, or it's a big Broadway show with a lot of mucky-mucks, these are often people who read, think for themselves, and are interested in a compelling story. And I started to, quite honestly, review in my mind and in my notes as many stories as I could recall of the hundreds that I had read about, studied, informed myself about, learned about in my own work, that could bring a general audience into the subject. And I have to say, somewhat, not covertly, but in a fairly sneaky way, and I mean that in the best sense of the word. Subversive is what I'm looking for, the word. And I thought, Forrestal was born in 1892. He was murdered in 1949. So the UFO story begins 2 years before he goes. And if I could tell the story in a dramatic manner, but a very straightforward manner, me and the audience, this is a very simple documentary. There are no major production values. It's me and a green screen and many, many images and some film clips. It's fairly intimate, but everything is fully documented. I went with no speculation whatsoever. And I wrote what amounts to a script. I can give this story, with my eyes closed and not a single note card and go for several hours, but I wanted that kind of control over what I was saying. And in April, a dear friend of mine, who hopefully you and I, two dear friends and close colleagues, will be returning to this show with at some point in the future,
Yes,
offered to assist the project. That's Jennifer Stein, a wonderful filmmaker, Philadelphia-based, and our dear friend and wonderful tech guy, Bob Terrio. I was giving a talk for a group that Jennifer runs called Mainline MUFON, that is one of those great regional groups that meets every month like clockwork and always has terrific presenters. And early that afternoon, Jennifer said, I have a home studio, and I now have green screen technology, and I have a new tool. It's called a teleprompter. Did you ever work with one? I said, no. She said, are you game? I know that you're comfortable holding a sheet of papers in your hands, but I've already loaded in the text. And Bob and I would like to work with you on this as co-producers. Well, we've worked together on many projects in the past, most notably the outstanding multiple award-winning documentary that I know you're familiar with, Travis, The True Story of Travis Walton, one of the best UFO documentaries ever made.
Yep.
And so that afternoon, we recorded it, and then they took over on the tech aspect, and what we ended up with was something I'm very proud of. And that's really the background of how I jumped into this project in the manner that I did with a film rather than a lecture or another article.
How long is the documentary? What's the running time on it?
A matter of seconds, over an hour, pretty much an hour on the nose.
This is, you've said several things that are important, and I want to reach out to all of you listening and let you know that when James Forrestal was murdered, they claimed it was suicide, but I think a lot of people even back then realized there was something wrong with the story. It hurt America like John Kennedy's murder hurt America. It was similar to that. He was a giant. We had been through the war. We hadn't been through the war with John Kennedy. Forrestal carried America through the war in many ways.
Yes.
And the cast of characters around him, General George Marshall, Roscoe Hillencutter, Vannevar Bush, Frank Knox, that despicable Harry Truman. I have never liked that dirty, rotten piece of garbage any more than I've liked that other dirty, rotten piece of garbage, FDR. Thank you. That's my opinion. Dean Acheson, who really lasted quite a long time before he finally passed. These people and all the giants were bigger-than-life characters because we had been through this war. And it's important to note that James Forrestal has been given a place in history that is nothing much less than oblivion. And it is wrong.
That's right. And you brought in President Kennedy, who not only was not cast to oblivion, we all remember him, and it was one of the things that compelled me to move out of my comfort zone, because I really gotten quite angry over a long period of time that even among the best educated, most knowledgeable and worldly people I knew, they drew a complete blank with his name. The exceptions might be somebody who had attended Princeton University. Although Forrestal didn't graduate, he left to join the Navy and fight in World War I, but it ended before he could be deployed. Princeton has a James Forrestal campus. Princeton, New Jersey has a James Forrestal shopping center. There is a medal within the intelligence community, a very high achieving medal named after the secretary. If one takes the tour of the Pentagon, when you walk in the main entrance, there's a bust of him. And then again, we have the carrier. But otherwise, yes, you chose the right word, Jeff. He was cast to oblivion. And I thought, I know individuals can make a difference. I have. You have. History is littered with them. And we do make a difference. And I thought, I think I can do this on my own. I know his life backwards and forwards. I've read everything published on him, and I'm going to do it. And so I did. And for me, I hope more than anything that this not only reaches a wider audience than just our friends in ufology, but that it puts him back on the map and makes him a point of discussion and respect. Again, let's face it, we live in a time where the term patriot is bandied about, often by thugs, and it's lost some of its meaning. This man was the living definition of a patriotic American, and people need to know that about him.
Compared to people like Truman?
Well, I don't know. We could spend a whole evening arguing about Harry Truman. He was an everyman who was a political hack who became vice president in a deal. FDR didn't want anything to do with him. And you remind me that there is a place in one of Vannevar Bush's 3 memoirs, he's a great writer, where he talks about walking into the Oval Office on the afternoon of April 12th, the day that FDR died in Warm Springs, Georgia, and saying in so many words, Mr. President, it's my solemn duty to inform you of a top-secret project called the Manhattan Project. He had no idea about it. Again, we can argue his merits or not all evening, but we'd go off on a tangent that would need several shows.
No, well said. That's fine. You know, the other thing, you mentioned Manhattan Project and the 2 bombs used on the Japanese, which really didn't need to be used. I think most people know that. And one of them, they were so different, the 2 bombs. Here you are making the first 2 atomic bombs in history. You'd think that they'd be damn close. You'd make one, then you clone it. You'd make 2. You know they work. The technology you had was there. These 2 bombs were vastly different, and it is arguable from my perspective that the fuel for the second bomb came from that surrendered, captured German U-boat that was headed to Japan with fissionable material on it. We got that material, and I think we used it for the second bomb. That's neither here nor there, but that's just
fascinating.
Yeah, it could well be. I forget the number of the U-boat, but they had 2 262 jets taken down in crates on board. They had all of this refined uranium, and I think that was used in the second bomb. But anyhow, this part of history is just not known. Your goal to bring Forrestal out of the shadows, at least to the degree that you are able as a human being to do, given what we're restricted by, is so admirable. And I hope I will do everything I can to help. I hope you're able to enter this in as many of those film festivals as you can. For some reason, they seem to mean something. ultimately it's about distribution. You got to get a distributor excited about this, and let's hope that happens. Go on, please.
Again, because it's a very a simple piece of film. Let's face it, most of our viewing audiences are fairly sophisticated, and we've been very fortunate to have some very fine documentaries on hidden history, on UFOs.
Yeah.
I'm looking toward next year very much to two very fine, probably will come as close to being the best UFO documentaries thus far. One we've been anticipating for several years from the great James Fox, and the other, lesser known, but I expect it will make as big a splash, a very dedicated filmmaker who is a close colleague of mine and Bud Hopkins, has been working away for over a decade. His name is Randall Nickerson, and he is completing final touches on an extended documentary about the famous Zimbabwe-Africa UFO incident from some years ago. Mine is not that, but my producers believe in it enough that it is actually now available as a DVD in limited distribution. We'll go over that at the end of the show. It will be available next month for downloading from an Amazon platform. And then it will go into several language subtitled variations. And even though it is an innately American story, it runs like fiction, Jeff. If F. Scott Fitzgerald had needed a real-life person to base his most famous literary character on, Jay Gadsby, James Forrestal could have been it. It really reads like a Horatio Alger novel and then turns into high Greek tragedy. And there's nothing that one has to do.
The Shakespearean tragedy is what it is. Yeah, this is really important, and I hope that the film festivals will take note of the fact that this is really a lost, suppressed, but a lost, a crucial moment in American history.
That's
the
correct.
Death of Forrestal turned so many things in such different directions. Watershed is the word I guess you want to use. Big story. Here's a quickie, just for all of you out there who have been following this U.S. Navy Tic Tac story, right? It's just out today, a couple days ago actually. Navy officers say unknown individuals made them erase evidence of the 2004 UFO encounter. Now, I don't know if you've seen this story or not. I hadn't. I just came across it today. Several Navy officers who witnessed the now famous Nimitz UFO encounter in 2004 say unknown individuals showed up after the event and made them turn over data recordings and videos. This according to Popular Mechanics. For several days in November 2004, a Navy missile cruiser sailing around 160 kilometers, 100 miles, off the coast of southern Cal, detected strange radar signals emanating from an object in the sky. The signals were erratic and didn't seem to match those given off by known aircraft. The Navy then deployed fighter jets to get a closer glimpse of the strange object, and one succeeded in recording a blurry black and white video that was, to the government's chagrin, publicly released in 2017, along with two other videos of UFO sightings from years later. So there you go. Once again, I thought when that Elizondo and the Tic Tacs came out and the Navy admitted that, yes, we see these things often, we don't know what they are, we see them up and down, especially off the East Coast was one of the venues, not just the Southern California sighting. But I figured that was pretty much the official end of the cover-up. So, well, they've announced it, they've made it clear, and people yawned and went about their daily business. Nobody did much of anything. But now they're trying to, it seems to me they're trying to, as they say, walk it back. Why, I don't know. There have been some uncomplimentary things said about Elizondo. I don't know what you know about Elizondo. I don't know too much. But this story didn't go where I thought it was going to go. I figured that they'd let it out, there wasn't much of a reaction, that they were going to follow up with some other things. They had to go all the way back to 2004 to allegedly find some video they could release. My God, they've got warehouses full of videos. We know this. So, okay. Anyway, go ahead, please.
Where would you like me to pick up?
I think what we need to do is, what I was saying was, I hope that these film festivals realize the importance of this documentary in terms of our birthright to understand our cultural and political history. This is crucial to that.
Yes, I obviously hope so as well, Jeff, and we are dedicated to entering it into as many film festivals here and abroad as possible. Time will tell if, the people that oversee these are interested enough in the story. I think it has so many hooks in it that...
huge.
The other thing is, I was looking for a story where, by the time we introduce for the very first time the subject UFO, that anybody who had been following it with an interest in 20th century history or the Navy or mysteries within history would be so already engaged that even if they had thought for their whole lives that the subject of truly anomalous UFOs, their cover-up, their implications for humanity were nonsense, they're hooked. And then I can begin to present the information in a very lawyerly way, basically, to build the case for murder and for the tragic, profound, and very well-documented nervous breakdown that obviously had been building up inside of this man and fully manifested itself, don't you know, within minutes of his stepping down as our first Secretary of Defense and our second Secretary of Defense, a man named Frank Knox, taking over the job. He literally held on that long. He also, I have to report, and there's nothing specious about this, within the next 24 hours, made two very serious attempts to take his own life. I am convinced that he knew, with the kind of clarity that rarely happens in life, that in his mind, he had failed the president, he had failed the nation, and that he was now a security risk of the first order, and that he had to die. Like a good Roman soldier, he tried to throw himself on his sword, but was stopped. History tells us in no uncertain terms that within 48 hours, he had been institutionalized at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, and he was there for 6 weeks. He was held for the first several weeks, I'm sure, drugged, and then turned over to their very professional staff to be treated for depression in the manner that was prescribed at the time, 1949, and began to respond to the treatment and gain his will to live again and look forward to a life in retirement. And unfortunately, that signed his death warrant. He was due to be released on Sunday, May 22nd, 1949. One of his brothers had arranged to have him picked up that day and complete his recovery at the estate of a well-to-do friend in a very private, lovely, natural surroundings that would be a good location to continue getting well. And supposedly, several hours earlier, he went into a sudden, profound state of suicidal depression, found his door unlocked, wandered out across the hall to a efficiency kitchen with an unsecured window, and then, if we're to believe the story that the government put forward, decided to take his own life, but could not decide whether to hang himself, whether to choke himself to death, or go out the 16th floor window. Originally, the story was that he tried to do all three. I should say here, because it's important that your listeners know, I am not a mental health professional. However, I had the privilege for 8 years of serving as a volunteer and then a volunteer and a shift supervisor on, to put it bluntly, the busiest suicide hotline in the United States, the New York City branch of a wonderful British-based organization called Samaritans International.
Wow.
Over those years, I had many occasions to interface with mental health professionals, many of them not surprisingly very acquainted with suicide. And I had just gotten into this story, and over those years, when it was appropriate, I laid out the circumstances to individuals who had worked with many people who had attempted to or in fact had taken their lives. And in every single case, and these were psychiatrists, psychologists, psychiatric social workers, the response was the same. People that want to hang themselves, jumpers, jump. I have never heard of anything like this, and it just doesn't jive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was some other issues involved. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'd like to give your listeners a very brief, 2-minute capsulization of his life leading up to his disintegration and destruction.
We
James
have just for our listeners, if you look under Peter Robbins' name, you'll find a link to a 30-second video trailer of this documentary, so you can take a look at that as well. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jeff. Forrestal was born, Irish-American family, a few hours from where I live in central New York State, in a very modest circumstances. His dad was a contractor, active in local Democratic Party politics. His mother was a teacher, a lay teacher at a nearby Catholic school. As a boy, he was very competitive. He was a basketball star on his high school team. He was passionately in love with the sport of boxing. And he was an amateur boxer even up until his time working in the Pentagon. He was accepted to Dartmouth, a fine school now and a fine school then, but the following year had an opportunity to transfer to Princeton. I believe at the time it was an all-male school, and he found himself making friends with and meeting and mixing with the sons of some of the most wealthy and powerful individuals in America. He wanted to be a success in the American tradition and wanted all the trappings of it. And, who can blame him? And he made friends knowing that he wanted the good life, wanted to make a good living, and live an interesting, exciting life. 3 weeks before he was scheduled to graduate from Princeton, he left. The Navy sent him to Canada to train with the RAF to be a fighter pilot. Probably in the history of modern warfare, one of those jobs where you had the very best chance of dying very quickly, although it was very romantic and they had nice uniforms. Again, the war ended before he could be deployed. He returned to America, but not to Princeton. He went to Wall Street, and he worked hard. By 1923, he had become a partner in the firm that he was working at, and in 1926 became president. That same year, he married a socially prominent woman from a distinguished American family without money anymore. She was a editor at Vogue and a former Ziegfeld Follies showgirl. It was a big society wedding, but one that was doomed to failure from the start. James Forrestal liked women, and marriage constrained him even though he did it voluntarily and immediately started cheating on his wife. She on him. It was a very empty marriage very quickly, but in the roaring 20s it looked great, and, they didn't want for anything. As America went into the can with the Great Depression and into the early 30s when things were terrible for most Americans, he was one of the few leaders on Wall Street to keep his company afloat and make money for his investors. By the mid-30s, he had drawn the interest of an advisor of Roosevelt's, an old friend of his at Princeton, named Ferdinand Eberstadt, who had gone on to become a very successful banker. Eberstadt brought him to the attention of the president, and the president invited him to join a small but very prestigious group, nicknamed the Kitchen Cabinet, pun, or the $1-a-year men. These were millionaires, successful businessmen, I feel it's fair to say patriotic for sure, who put their careers on hold and moved to Washington to work with the president to help get us out of the Depression, and were paid a token $1 per year. James Forrestal took this call to public service extremely seriously, and he was the only one who never went back to his business life. He stayed in Washington and worked for 2 presidents for the rest of his life. In 1940, he was appointed Undersecretary of Navy and was soon directing and overseeing, imagine, the manufacture and flow of all the Navy's pre-war needs, an incredibly demanding task that he accomplished superbly by all accounts. In 1944, he was appointed Secretary of Navy on the death of Frank Knox, who had suffered a heart attack. Mm-hmm. One of the things that always impressed me about Forrestal was that would be, a plum job for many men who would just basically enjoy the power that they had and certainly not take any risks with their life. Forrestal put himself in harm's way repeatedly. I can only imagine horrifying some of his associates at the Pentagon. He was literally at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, at the Battle of Iwo Jima, Tokyo Bay. He was out there with his men. And at the end of the war, Roosevelt was dead, of course, and Harry Truman had an idea, quite visionary in a way, to dismantle the old War Department. The War Department had been a part of America since the Revolution. I don't like war. I hate it, but I like the name. It's a very honest name.
Sure it is.
And he asked Forrestal personally, not some, blue ribbon committee, but one man, to dismantle the War Department and create a new entity, something that would be called the Department of Defense. Once again, in the boiler room of alpha males surrounding the President of the United States under tremendous pressure to unify the service branches, he performed brilliantly. And so it was no surprise that in the spring of 1947, President Truman nominated him to be the first Secretary of Defense, something we would probably not see now. Both the House and Senate approved it 100%, everybody voting yes. And then the story starts to get really interesting. He was sworn in, I forget the exact date right now, but in like the 3rd week of September of 1947, incredibly suddenly. In fact, Truman ordered that he be sworn in that day while en route back to America on a battleship from a state visit to Brazil. An opponent of Truman's, a former vice president, somebody who wanted to be president, Henry Wallace, immediately made a very big deal of what was this about? Was there an emergency? And if so, what was it? And if there wasn't an emergency, insisting that this man be sworn in right now, that day, amounted to the worst kind of fear-mongering. Well, what was the emergency? As an investigative writer, this is where I have an opportunity to start to work in a very strict timeline. And we see that day there is a document. I have to say it's the only one that I present that I'm not sure if it's fully authentic. It is an MJ-12 document. It checks out in many respects about an investigation into a crash of an unknown object some miles from what was then a small town in New Mexico called Roswell. He was sworn in maybe 8 or 9 weeks after the Roswell crash. And you can bet that his first day as secretary, all of this stuff landed on his desk. If one looks at the job description, which he created for the Secretary of Defense, and the documentary includes a flow chart, you will see the tremendous weight that sat on his shoulders as the first Secretary of Defense. But because he was the man he was, he took this responsibility in a way that few others would. What do I mean by that? Number one, he always strived for excellence in his work, and he had, unfortunately, I can't even call it a character flaw. It was just part of who he was. He personalized all of his personal and professional successes and failures. If you or I or any of your listeners working a job have a particularly bad day at work,
right,
hopefully you still go home and actually or allegorically pet the dog, have dinner with your husband and wife.
He never unloaded it. He carried it. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Watch some TV and go back the next day and try to do a better job.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that from day one until he retired, in his mind, with the most powerful defense establishment in history, let's say since Atlantis, at least, or whatever.
Fair enough. Sure.
That he was unable to do anything to get to the bottom of this mystery, to even figure out what the threat was, if any, to the United States and the people of the world, and it ate him up. As Secretary of Defense, he did a remarkable job, and there are some wonderful print sources where listeners can learn more about his life in good establishment sources, as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, they don't deal with the UFO subject, but he worked hard. And the afternoon that he was scheduled to step down, there was a huge change of command ceremony in the courtyard of the Pentagon with, I think, several thousand people in attendance, and then a private ceremony in the Oval Office. And again, even for a screenwriter with a good imagination, to create what actually happened would be quite a stretch. There comes the moment where the president pins on his lapel, I'm not sure if it was the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but certainly at the time it was the highest decoration that a civilian could have, and he was now a civilian. And the president said, "You deserve it, Jim." And Forrestal stepped to the microphone and said, quote unquote, "It's beyond my," and then just stared out into the audience. There's a moment in the very large memoir by Clark Clifford, who was then a young apprentice at the Pentagon, but went on to become an attorney general, where he remembers being in that room, and he said, suddenly we all realized something was terribly wrong. At this point, Stuart Symington, who went on to become a Midwestern senator years later, but he was the first Secretary of Air Force, and he was particularly cantankerous and in Forrestal's face about funding for the Air Force, the new boy on the block, so to say, and helped to make his life somewhat miserable. And he was heard to say to Forrestal, quote unquote, "There is something I would like to talk to you about." Nobody knows what he then said to Forrestal, but it was obvious from the expression on his face that it really was had a tremendously bad impact on him. And within minutes, people noticed that he had disappeared from the room. A search of locations within the Pentagon was commenced immediately, and he was found sitting at his old desk in his old office. When the door was open, he didn't even seem to be aware of the people there, and he was staring at the wall, repeating the phrase, "You are a loyal fellow. You are a loyal fellow." Ultimately, he made his way out to the front of the Pentagon, and it was, of all people, Vannevar Bush's, and Vannevar Bush was Roosevelt and Truman's science and technology advisor, and maybe only the most interesting person of the 20th century. He's a whole nother story we could do show after show about. A fascinating man. Vannevar Bush's chauffeur saw him seemingly not aware of his surroundings and drove him home to his townhouse in Georgetown. Once home, he called Eberstadt, as close a friend as he had, and his other character flaws, as far as I'm concerned, he had hundreds of people he was friendly with. He was the kind of person, describing the kind of parties from the 1920s on the North Shore of Long Island. When he walked into that room, he became the center of attention. But he would never let anybody get too close. He walled himself off in that sense, and I think it helped cost him his life. He called Eberstadt and told him that he felt that his life had been a total failure, and he was considering killing himself. Eberstadt came right over, was shocked by his friend's appearance, and asked him in the most profound way what had happened, what was the story, what had caused him to feel that way. The response was, "I can't tell you. It's a secret." Eberstadt, ultimately, within a day, with a man named Robert Lovett, who was a protege of Forrestal's and a later Secretary of Defense, realized terrible problem going on here. And Eberstadt flew Forrestal in a private plane down to Hobie Sound, Florida, where Lovett had an estate. Lovett writes in his memoirs that he was at the airfield when the plane landed and was shocked by his old friend's appearance, but, tried to put on a happy face, and as soon as Forrestal stepped from the plane, he said, "I hope you brought your golf clubs, Jim, because the weather here has been great for golf." Forrestal's response was, "Bob, they're after me." There was no question in Forrestal's mind that there were powerful men around Truman who resented his closeness to Truman, the fact that he had distinguished himself in so many ways for so long. They respected him, but they were jealous. Unfortunately, Mr. Forrestal made a miscalculation, but one based on common sense. Many of your listeners with any interest in 20th century history know that as we were coming toward the November 1948 election, it looked like the Republican candidate, the then governor of my state, Thomas E. Dewey, was going to cream Truman. And of course, it was one of the biggest upsets in American political history. Leading to the election, Forrestal was concerned that the man that he served and admired was going to lose. And he said out loud to Lovett, wouldn't it make sense for somebody within the administration to discreetly interface with somebody from the Dewey team just to set up a liaison in the event that the presidency would change hands? Now, that, of course, is common practice for more than 50 years, but in 1949, not only was it not, Lovett, I think he really admired and liked Forrestal, but he repeated this to the wrong person, and it was spun to death to make Forrestal look like he was disloyal to the president. I think he would have literally died for Roosevelt or Truman, or anybody else who was president. The presidency...
Well, that's the ultimate patriotism, sure.
Yes,
of course.
Exactly. And it was, unfortunately, the tragedy was Truman believed it. And in in Forrestal's very shaken state of people coming at him left and right, Truman refused to even meet with him for several weeks after the election, which, good Lord, the impact on a sensitive person,
yeah, of course,
is incalculable.
We're almost out of time, Peter. Would you come back? Can we finish this conversation on another night? I'd like that.
I'd be honored to.
Well, I've got an opening day after tomorrow, same time, Wednesday, so see how that works with your schedule.
You know
some
what?
things Go ahead.
I'll check my schedule right now while we're on the phone.
Yeah.
And I'd be glad to.
Great. All right, because there's a lot of things I want to ask you and talk about, but this narrative has been so interesting and important, I didn't want to interrupt. So we'll see you Wednesday, day after tomorrow, same time. Peter Robbins, thank you so much. The documentary on James Forrestal is going to be extremely important. Just a jewel of importance from our unknown history that has been kept from us. Thank you, Peter. Look forward to talking to you on Wednesday.
Me too, Jeff. Have a great evening.
Okay, thanks a lot. Peter Robbins. So we'll have him back Wednesday. I've got a lot of things I want to ask him. This is a huge story that has never been told, and now it's about to be told. All right, we will be back. Okay, welcome back. Looking forward to this hour very much. We had the pleasure of talking to Peter Robbins just 2 nights ago about our first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, murdered. And it's a big story, such a big story, in fact, that Peter Robbins has created a new documentary film on this subject. It's a 1-hour-long documentary. It'll be coming out widely very soon. And I'm looking forward to getting a preview chance, as it were, to view it in the next couple of days. My days just don't have the time, or I'd jump all over it. And Peter was kind enough to send me a preview link for it. So I'm going ahead without having seen it, but in light of Monday's conversation, this is truly a part 2, and there are some extraordinarily important things we didn't get a chance to touch upon then, and I'm sure that Peter right now is thinking of a long list of those things. I've got some things as well. Welcome back, Mr. Robbins.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be back.
Yeah, we've got a really wonderful issue here at the program in the archives. We have over 50 hours with Bill Tompkins, William Tompkins. We call him a child prodigy who was taken into the Navy and worked through World War II at a very high level in terms of debriefing American spies who were sent to Germany. German-speaking American citizens who volunteered were sent there, and they would come back and they were debriefed, and he was involved with that, among other things. Now, do you know anything in particular about Bill Tompkins and the fact that this program reported directly to James Forrestal during the war?
No, I was not aware of that.
Yeah, it's a very, very big story, and we've covered it at some length here.
Huh.
We'll get you some more information on that. Frank has it all. He's got the story. Bill Tompkins discussed it at great length on the program. Maybe we can get Frank to find the actual program in which that was talked about. He talked about a lot of things.
That would be great. I would so appreciate that.
Forrestal's connection with that program was very important, but even more, I think, accessible to our listeners was James Forrestal's, certainly if not creation, his leadership over Operation High Jump. Operation High Jump remains the central focus of some of the most lively online conspiracy theories that you can imagine.
Yes.
It was a very unique and strange major task force put together after the war and sent to, we'll just call it the Antarctic region, and let you take it from there. What do you know about Forrestal's supervision, his vision in general about this remarkable operation, and what happened?
Yeah, it's really a hole in the Forrestal archive, so to say. We know most certainly he had to have overseen it, if only for deductive reasoning. The man was the head of the Defense Department, had more power in this country between September of 1947 and February of 1949 than any other person except for Harry Truman, bar none. Admiral Byrd, of course, went down to the Antarctic with a military task force, I believe in excess of 800 armed soldiers. Even the news coverage, the limited amount that came out to the general readership at the time, was enigmatic and incomplete. What we do know is that they came back with dead and wounded. Byrd made, I believe, 2 statements, both of them, again, extremely enigmatic. We were left, as a nation, to think we had a battle. Who could it have been with?
Right.
We're not left with many routine options. Take your pick.
Peter, excuse me, did we ever get a satisfactorily accurate count of the casualties and losses suffered during Operation High Jump? This was the biggest battle fleet put together since World War II.
That's correct.
And it was clearly sent down there for a very specific reason. Yeah.
To the best of my knowledge, no official figures were published. Rumor, myth, legend has it that it was at least dozens and dozens of men that did not come back. It could have been far higher. There are so many sources that are, how can I say kindly, not confirmable. And it's so tempting to want to jump onto one of them and put it forward as confirmed fact. I have to bite my tongue at moments like that because I try to have a very high standard of what I consider proof or evidence, and it's
you're
sorely
meticulous
lacking.
about it. You're a legend in that area. Yes, no, you do some.
It's incredibly frustrating because, like the story of James Forrestal himself, his extraordinary, almost Horatio Alger-like fictional ascent from small-town boy to second most powerful man in the world to the Greek tragedy that took his life from him and from the American people. This is another question that demands answers, but at that level of the game, I think.
Admiral Byrd's 2 comments. Enigmatic is a conservative word. They were absolutely off the wall, wacky in some respects when you think about them. He warned the world about things. This is bizarre. This man was, again, in charge of the biggest combat fleet put together since World War II, and sent off on a mission that was never fully explained to the American people.
The other thing is the choice of Admiral Byrd, as opposed to any of a number of ranking, distinguished, courageous war veteran admirals that could have been chosen for this particular mission. It's almost as if he was chosen in part because he was the one who was a legend. His polar expeditions are a big part of the history of exploration of the early 20th century. And if he had done nothing else, he would be remembered through history for his accomplishments in that area.
Yes, right.
It's almost not to demean it by saying it's a show business definition, but they chose someone with such high visibility. It's almost like they wanted the world to know that we were going in and that the guy at the head was the equivalent of a movie star in the military. And yet when he came back, it was all hushed up. When I look at events that transform history or that may have that we don't learn about, I try to go to sources that were the establishment sources of the time and the reactionary sources on both sides. In this case, the New York Times coverage. The Times was not the newspaper in 1948 that it is now. But they were perplexed, and the articles that I saw, I think there were 2 published, at least, we were left hanging. They didn't know the answers to the questions that they were asking. It would be wonderful if we could get into some kind of post-national security state, and I don't think there's any chance that.
No,
we are locked
happen.
in, and we will be victimized by it for the rest of our lives, our children's lives, and on into the future. But in the what-if area of thinking, wouldn't it be something if we could get into that archive? I guess we have about as much chance as getting into the basement of the Vatican archive.
About it. Byrd was an American hero. We got to remember that. War included. But in 1928, he led an Antarctic expedition which caused a national frenzy. It just captured the imagination of the nation. It was a big deal, and that was 20 years before Operation High Jump.
Yeah, I heard about Operation High Jump for the first time in the late 1970s as I was kind of starting to get my day and night obsession about the UFO subject into some kind of control and begin a more organized study of it. And I'm not a conspiracist per se, but as they say, you don't have to be a paranoid to know that someone is following you. History, by definition, is defined by conspiracies. It's one or more people, 2 or more people conspiring in secret, usually with nefarious purposes. And I resisted, for me, what were the only 2 things I could begin to wrap my head around, and one sounded more ludicrous than the other. One was aliens, and the other was Nazis. And here we are, many years later, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, and I still keep thinking aliens and Nazis. We don't have a lot of options there. It wasn't an army of polar bears or penguins or something. This was, military fighting a military situation. And, boy, I would give anything to know the answer to that one, Jeff.
I agree. This story has so many holes in it. The aircraft carrier that went down there, the number of people who didn't come back, we don't know. We just don't know the truth, and it's all completely hidden away.
Yeah. It's the stuff that, I won't say it's the stuff that dreams are made of, a wonderful ending to one of my favorite novels, The Maltese Falcon, but it is the kind of thing that can keep you up at night wondering, and I keep hitting the wall on it. I'm your dream is that you wake up one morning and find that some scholar has been working away at the risk of their life for decades and has just published a book, and you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, and it becomes an international bestseller and creates pressure that might change something.
Right.
Again, that's sort of a dreamy idea, but we're up against a hard wall here.
Operation High Jump. For those of you who don't know anything about it, it'd be well worth doing a little search. There's a lot of material out there.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find a soundbite, if I can, with Richard Byrd talking about this. I've seen one once in the past, and it was very interesting. His comment in that Chilean newspaper, though,
yes,
really was a mind bender when you think about it. And I'm going to find that here before we're finished. And,
that would be great. That would be great. And his public life after that became a non-public life for someone who had been such a star in their time and a very in-demand presence in military and civilian circles as a speaker and, the kind of person that, of course, you would want to interface with. But probably with good reason. He did not speak about it, certainly publicly, after the fact for the rest of his life.
Correct. Okay, let's see here. One more little quick look. Well, we see this whole thing about New Schwabenland and
well, yes,
Nazis
exactly.
and UFOs. It might have been Nazis, not or it might have been Nazis and. We don't want to think about those two things as two separate issues. Have you seen the YouTube video I put together of the German flying discs? I've got two pieces of black and white film showing two different models of German discs actually flying. And
when did you post that, Jeff? About when did you post that?
Well, I added the second piece of historic black and white film to it about 5 or 6 months ago.
Oh, no, I haven't seen that.
I'll make sure. Frank, would you send him the one that says now there are two pieces of film? And Peter needs to see that. If you don't, I'll
Can I ask you, Jeff, if you can say it on the air, what was your source for that footage?
I didn't get it in an unmarked envelope. I found it online, and it was just sheer happenstance and luck.
Did your gut tell you, because we now live in an age where it doesn't matter what, anything can be convincingly faked on film.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. This is, I have no doubt in my mind that these are real pieces of footage. And when you see them, I think your instinct, your intuition will tell you the same thing.
Yeah.
There are, in all likelihood, miles of film in a warehouse somewhere.
Can you imagine?
No, that we have.
I think of the wonderful warehouse at the end of the first Indiana Jones film, one of the great end shots in all time in film history, right up there with Citizen Kane.
That was it. I concur, 100%. Here are some little bits from Admiral Byrd's Chilean newspaper interview. The story: Did Rear Admiral Byrd, U.S. Naval Commander, encounter advanced technology in Antarctica during Operation High Jump in early 1947? And was this the reason why a scheduled 6-month-long, quote, exploration was abandoned after only 2 months? Important for the research into this question is the interview given by Admiral Byrd to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, published 5 March 1947. Historians never referred to it. I have the actual news clipping, and what follows is my translation from the Spanish language original. There are a few preliminary points which must be made. Rear Admiral Byrd was a serving naval officer in charge of a major Antarctic expedition involving 10 ships and 4,000 total men. In the El Mercurio article, Admiral Byrd reports a major threat to the existence of the U.S. from an unspecified enemy. That's what he talked about. Now, this is after the operation was canceled and the ships were moved away after 2 months.
Yeah.
If a major threat to the security of the United States had become known to him, this should have been reported secretly to the Pentagon and not first to a Chilean newspaper. The United States at the time was the world's only atomic power and was the most powerful nation on Earth. The foregoing facts, when read with the article, indicate that the balance of Admiral Byrd's mind was deeply disturbed. He had not been removed from command, and therefore he was not certifiably insane in the opinion of the Operation High Jump, medical officers. Accordingly, it is very possible that a threat had been delivered and that other members attached to the Operation High Jump knew of it, a threat of some kind. Here's from the newspaper now. Admiral Richard Byrd, according to the newspaper, warned today that it is necessary for the United States to adopt protective measures against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile aircraft proceeding from the polar regions. Those who seek to minimize what Byrd was saying state that by his use of the term invasion, he actually meant invasion of U.S. airspace, and nothing is so ridiculous of an invasion of the physical country. He said, "It is not my intention to scare anyone, but the bitter reality is that if a new war should come, the United States will be attacked by aircraft flying in from over one or both poles." This statement was made in recapitulating Byrd's findings as a polar explorer in an exclusive interview for international news services. On the subject of the recently concluded expedition, Operation High Jump, Byrd said that the most important result of the observations and discoveries made is the modern potential which they bear in relation to the security of the United States. He said, "The fantastic speed with which the world is developing is one of the objective lessons learnt during the Antarctic exploration recently effected. I cannot do more than deliver a strong warning to my compatriots in the sense that the time has already passed in which we can take refuge in isolation and rest in the confidence that distance, the oceans, and the poles constitute a guarantee of security." So he went on from there and said some other things about his earlier career when he explored the Antarctic and so forth. So Operation High Jump is a very big issue. No doubt James Forrestal knew all about it. He planned it. He appointed Byrd to lead it. It was called off after 2 months. 4,000 men, all those ships, and apparently a lot of dead and wounded.
Jeff, to interject for a moment, to give me kind of a point of reference, what is the enclosed dates of that mission from departure to return?
I don't have that at hand here. Let me see if I can find it. He gave that interview March 5, 1947. Keep in mind, if we went down there in our winter, January, February, March, that's their summer. So remember, that's why it was planned. The first expedition, August 26th, 1946, Operation High Jump. Okay? That's moving into their spring down there.
Okay, then I have to introduce a thought here, which is the swearing-in ceremony of James Forrestal as our first Secretary of Defense, at which point he would have been privy to a level of classified material that he would not have to before, was in I believe the third week of September of 1947. So he actually may have been completely out of that
loop. In the dark. Yeah. Yes. August 26th, 1946.
Yep.
The newspaper El Mercurio, did I say March? I think I said March. 1947.
Yeah. So, he may have been out of that loop.
So the ships were all pulled, 4,000 men or however many were left, sailed around the southern tip of South America, up the west coast of South America, and they docked and he went into, I guess, Santiago. I don't know which city. It would have been one of them. This is all there.
It's worth noting that not a single individual, they would have all been Navy, well, not necessarily, that's an assumption, but not a single individual is on record as having ever said a word or published a word about anything involving this subject.
Correct. They were told, you talk and you're done.
Yeah.
Real simple. This was shut down, and they took it to the grave with them.
Yep.
Absolutely. No deathbed confessions have I ever heard about this.
Yeah. Isn't that something?
Yeah, it is. All right, let's go on with our story and about the documentary. And I didn't mean to take up so much time with this, but it is important.
Fascinating.
Forrestal was the man who sent that naval task force to the Antarctic. So there you go.
Well, again, I don't know, because he was not sworn in as Secretary of Defense until September of 1947. Before that, he would have been in that period between stepping down as the Secretary of Navy and Truman's point man in creating the Defense Department, which may or may not have given him a security clearance. Here we're in informed guesswork. So it's a gray area.
The story here appears to be a good one. Operation High Jump, which was basically an invasion of the Antarctic, consisted of 3 naval battle groups which departed Norfolk, Virginia on 2 December 1946. They were led by Admiral Richard E. Byrd's command ship, the icebreaker Northwind, and consisted of the catapult ship Pine Island, destroyer aircraft carrier Philippine Seas, U.S. submarine Senate, 2 support vessels, etc., etc. So the story's here. What Mr. Forrestal knew, when he knew it, we don't know. This may well have played a role in the astounding amount of stress that he was put under. Imagine someone who had gone through the war with normal human machines, men, equipment, suddenly finding something, at least reports of something, that defied description.
Exactly.
Okay, so I don't know how much you want to give up about the 1-hour documentary, but we don't want to tell the whole story. So you might give us...
I'm glad to take any question or pick up at any point that you would like, or zone in on, decline, institutionalization, murder, investigation into the murder, go back to, some of his extraordinary...
All right, well, we'll work toward that. You've been involved in UFO studies for 40 years plus.
Oh, yes.
This is a big, obvious area of, in my view, utter reality that has been rather ridiculously covered up by this alleged government, and rather poorly so. All one has to do is read the research. Stanton Friedman always talked about that. It's there.
The best.
So with this documentary, how much in the documentary are UFOs even mentioned? How much did you put into it?
Let me say first, briefly, when I conceived of this project, I had a very subversive goal. I don't know how else to say it. I wanted to tell a very important story about a man who we should all know about, who was lost to history, a true American hero and patriot. But
Absolutely.
I wanted it to proceed in such a way that by the time I did bring the UFO subject into the story, that people who were watching it, and on the liner notes, on the DVD even, there's not a mention of the UFO subject. The story begins in 1892 with his birth, and it's not until 1947, I proceed in a strictly linear way, that it comes up. Once it does, however, I go week to week, month to month, to a degree, inserting into the timeline key moments in case studies and things that there's no question that they would have crossed his desk. My goal was to go beyond the audience of people that you and I usually reach, namely the folks who are already interested in this subject. I wanted to tell a story, and it really is a very simple production. We're sophisticated viewers. This is me and you. I'm looking at you, telling you the story. I disappear. Nice. It's green screen. I come back. We look at 150 or so images. We look at film clips. It's methodical. And again, it's not until about halfway through, because the second half of the film is devoted to his breakdown, his institutionalization, the circumstances surrounding his death, and then my investigation into his death. So UFOs are a core part of the reason that I feel the stress thereof and having to keep this secret.
Oh, the timing
contributed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and as I mentioned on Monday, for people, and I don't mean to sound dispassionate here because we're talking about life and death, for people whose life circumstances have brought them into a time in their life when they are not just depressed, but suicidally depressed. Imagine you are in such pain, or you want to escape the reality you're in so much that you don't care, that all the people that care about you are just going to be left behind. You don't care that you will not go on because there is so much you want to get away from. It's a very sobering point of view.
And you don't care about also, Peter, the grief and pain you're going to cause them. Someone once described suicide to me as the most selfish act of all.
You know what? It's a terrible thing to say, but it's actually quite accurate. You're basically saying something I can't say on the air to the world, and then just pulling the cord. The thing is, one of the tragedies within the tragedy is that moment is often simply a moment. And if you can hold on for the evening, or the day, or the hour, or the minute, you can back away from that ledge, or put that gun down, or put that bottle down. I can't tell you how many people I spoke to over the years in my capacity as a hotline worker. But it's, again, the tragedy within the tragedy. As I mentioned on Monday, I am convinced that James Forrestal understood that in the minds of a number of very powerful people high up in the American government, his breakdown, which was building up slowly, and I'm not saying it was all due to one thing. In fact, living such a complex life, just Operation High Jump, learning about it after the fact, sitting down at your desk for the first time on the first day of being Secretary of Defense, the first Secretary of Defense. It's 9 weeks after Roswell. It's 10 weeks after Kenneth Arnold. It's all on your desk. You had read the newspaper articles, you either laughed or thought they were serious, but all of a sudden there is nowhere to run. And unlike Harry Truman, it was Forrestal's job to get to the bottom of it. Truman wanted that, of course, any president would, but it wasn't Truman's job. And that weight on his shoulders was crushing. Again, we can only imagine. I am convinced, though, that once that level of depression manifested itself in a full-scale nervous breakdown, and an incredibly public nervous breakdown, that the physical unwinding, who knows how hard he was working to keep all this in. We know he was unwinding the last couple of weeks, certainly, but it happened within minutes of his stepping down as the first Secretary of Defense. In a way, that is a mark of what his dedication was to this country. He was holding on until the last minute, and then he gave up. Again, I have to remake this point now, and I think in your huge audience, I'd be willing to bet that there's almost nobody, if nobody, who has not themselves or had a family member or a friend or somebody they know in the workplace or somebody they grew up with who has not seen a psychiatrist or a psychologist or gone to see a counselor or gotten therapy, or kids has. It's the nature of the modern Western first world. In 1949, it was exactly the opposite. No one knew anyone. And here he is, the ultimate alpha male in this boiler room of alpha males at the top of the pinnacle of power in Washington, D.C., the one they all looked up to, the amateur boxer, the professional level golfer, the guy who was a member of the Algonquin Round Table and numbered great writers and film stars among his friends, the womanizer extraordinaire, very handsome, great dresser, head of the Defense Department, naval war hero in terms of putting himself in harm's way as Secretary of the Navy, and he has a nervous breakdown? It took me years, Jeff, to get to the point where I could say to myself, it's so easy to make these men into cartoon villains. How dare they keep the truth from us? How dare they murder this good and decent man for what might happen? And I think their idea was not that he's going to blurt everything out, But if he got well, whatever that meant, because it was a complete abstraction to them, and then he had a relapse, that made him the greatest threat to national security in the Western world, potentially. But thinking like a mob boss, it's nothing personal. It's just business. He had to die. He knew it. And as I mentioned on Monday, and as I document in the documentary, he tried to kill himself twice within the 48 hours after he was stepped down. But he was stopped by friends who cared for him, and then institutionalized, and then treated. And the tragedy within the tragedy is that he responded to treatment. You'll see the articles, you'll hear quotes from medical records. Everybody who saw him, all of his doctors, Truman, other high-ranking people, the head of neuropsychiatry, as it was called back then at Bethesda Naval Hospital, he's getting better. He gained 12 pounds. He's taking pride in his appearance again. He's looking forward to continuing his recovery at a friend's estate. Yes, people can have a turnaround in their condition, and somebody who seems to be coming along nicely can then surprise us by taking their life. But nothing here fit that profile. And once it was understood that he wanted to live, I think the people around Truman, who were, of course, aware of his suicide attempts, admired him for it. I don't know how else to say it. He was a good Roman soldier, and he was trying to throw himself on his sword because he understood the way they thought. But then things went out of control. And when I say that, I mean he decided he wanted to live. And that's where he signed his death warrant. And again, those men, because it wasn't one, it had to be at least two, possibly three, who got into the Bethesda Naval Hospital. They obviously had credentials. Maybe they were wearing white jackets. We're talking about 10 minutes before 2 in the morning. It was a quiet hallway on the 16th floor. Even as they forced him out that window, after tying his bathrobe sash tight around his neck, and then pushed him away from the ledge that he went out of was covered with fingernail scratch marks. I mean, this is chilling stuff, and it's documented.
Wow.
Those men, even as they caused his death, may have admired him, may have respected him, may have looked up to him. Again, that, for me, that ultimate mob phase is hitman gives you 2 in the back of the head with the silenced 22. It's nothing personal. It's just business.
Think about, for those who may say, well, they couldn't go into a hospital and do that. Let me just say the name. Epstein. Jail.
Yeah. Perfect
locked
example.
Up. Okay.
There's another guy who had to die.
Yeah, they can do anything they want. It's that simple.
We learned that in November 1963, if we didn't know it already.
Certainly did. It's interesting to me how, and you know this better than anyone, how the Navy is firmly embedded in the whole UFO ET milieu. The Navy.
Truly.
It's not the Army, it's not the Air Force, It's not the CIA, it's just not any of the agencies. It's the Navy.
From the get-go.
Here's from the beginning, and here's Mr. Forrestal.
Yeah.
Clearly with Roswell on his desk, right?
Yeah.
I believe that.
Oh, yeah.
Just probably knocked him over. He couldn't believe it. And they probably took him and showed him the bodies. Here they are.
Yeah.
And everything he knew, everything he had spent his life studying, researching, exploring, all of a sudden was in the shadows. It was just pushed off the stage. Here we are facing intelligent life from somewhere with technology we can't even.
Well said. I think it's important to remember, for me, I went through years, if not decades, kind of raging at the universe and power to the people and let out everything now and we can handle it and you've no right to keep this greatest secret in human history from us. It took me a long time to even allow myself to try to get behind the eyes, if you know what I mean, of the men around Truman at that moment in time. You know, there is evidence to suggest that the truly anomalous UFO phenomena, and I separate that from UFOs or the more contemporary terms for them, a UFO is an unidentified flying object. And in modern times especially, I think the majority, if not the great majority, of things seen in the sky that are reported as UFOs, it's us. We all know. We've got stuff up there that borders on science fiction, if not seeming to mimic what they can do, but not back in the 40s. And it took me a while to say to myself, even almost putting myself in a bag and kicking and screaming as I dragged myself from one room to the other, these men may well have been doing what they felt was the absolute right thing for the security of the United States and for the peace of mind of a war-weary nation about to face a whole nother war. One of my favorite little factoids about the birth of the so-called modern age of UFOs is, you know, Kenneth Arnold was June 24th, 1947. We do not know the exact date of the Roswell crash. Was it July 30th, the 31st? I'm June 30th, the 31st, or July 1st. We don't know. But we do know that immediately the information started cascading out. And the concerns of a nation going to pieces while we have the jitters. In July of 1947, Foreign Affairs, a very distinguished publication, still front and center in the diplomatic and political community, published an article under a pseudonym. The writer was listed as X. In reality, it was George Kennan. Kennan was a 30-something political scholar who lived, if I remember correctly, a zillion people can Google it right now, to about 101 and was an advisor to, I believe, 9 American presidents. He published an article, Jeff, called On Containment, and it was a thinking through of now that we beat the Axis powers and America with the Marshall Plan and our enlightened attitude, we have helped to save the world and move forward in a way hopefully free of fascism. That didn't work out too well. But he coined the term and the idea that if we could throw up the equivalent of an iron curtain at the borders that the Soviets had expanded into by the summer of 1945, we might be able to avoid a hot war, a military term for shooting war, and in its place create a Cold War. That's where the term came from. It goes back to July of 1947, and in fact, and I believe this is coincidence, they do happen sometimes, the fact is that at the same moment in history that the modern age of UFOs was born, the Cold War was born as well. And as we know, and has been brilliantly illustrated in such works as my friend and soul brother Richard Dolan's UFOs and the National Security State Parts 1 and Part 2, they were used brilliantly. The interplay of covering a military subject with a UFO possibility, or a report of a UFO to mask a military test or something. Americans did it, and the Soviets did it. And it was part of ultimately MAD, M-A-D-D, the mutual assured destruction, where we can destroy you, you can destroy us, we'll rattle sables at each other for 45 years, but it worked. It worked. like a house of cards standing on itself. We didn't have a nuclear war. And then, of course, 1989 and 1990 rolled around, and the Soviet Union disintegrated.
Indeed. Are you getting any new information about Forrestal since you have announced and engaged in the project and created it?
No, I have not. But again, even though the DVD is available, and it's starting to move in a very limited way, it won't be until sometime next month when I hope I'll be able to return with my two producers, Jennifer Stein and Bob Terrio.
Yeah, we're
it won't be
back.
Till next month that it will be available as a download on Amazon, and that is when people will really start watching it. Then something may bite, maybe not, but I don't think it'll happen until it's internationally available as a download sometime next month.
Right.
Yeah.
I've always wondered about people with knowledge, and I wonder about the intensity, the ferocity of the threats that they're given. They don't have to be particularly verbose.
Yeah.
Very simple, one sentence. Do you like your children? Do you love your grandchildren?
Yes.
Very simple.
Yep.
Then we don't want to hear one word about this. Before or after you pass. That's it.
That's right. We all know and have heard accounts, alleged accounts, by people who put forward that they were involved in this top secret, above secret project, and they come forward at risk of their life, which may or not be self-aggrandizing, to be kind. Other people who don't talk about it may in fact be living with a threat. At a point when I was several years into deep investigating of Great Britain's best-known UFO incident, the Rendlesham Forest incident of December 1980, I realized quite simply, in a number of ways, that I was in over my head. I could be spending my afternoons in Bud Hopkins' studio working as his assistant, just feeling very proud of the work that I was doing and going out to dinner with Bud and, having a nice evening with my friends. But there came a time when I became frightened. It wasn't a threat, but I knew, because I had a moonlighting, what we called then bell telephone, because it was before they broke up the monopoly, check out my phone lines. And he said, there's definitely impedance on these lines. It's irregular, but it's real. And I had him do it, partly out of a romantic sense of course it's not, but, I'm really cool. I'm doing UFO investigative work. And I got very defensive and immediately said to him, well, that's crazy, because I called you in because I'm hearing these clicks and taps and strange noises on my phone occasionally. Then they've let me know, and it's defeated their purpose. And he said, no, there are two very specific reasons that your phone might be being monitored in that manner. One is, of course, to surreptitiously listen in on what you're saying, and the other is to rattle you. And at that point, I sat down, show you how long this was ago, had my IBM Selectric typewriter, and I typed out not so
Wonderful
much...
machine. I love the Selectric.
Analog technology, baby. Yeah. I typed out, I still have it, not a will, but just a statement of intention.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
I put it in my safe deposit box, and nothing came of it. And I kind of forgot about it after a while, but it was very simple. And what it was this. If at some point somebody comes into my life and either by way of credential or some other way beyond a reasonable doubt identifies themselves as who they are, and they say to me, stop doing what you're doing or we may kill you, I will consider stop doing what I'm doing. If they say to me, stop doing what you're doing, or something may happen to somebody you love very much, I'm out of it. I walk away right there. I'm not interested in, going into it.
find another career, and that's that. It never happened. But I felt compelled at that point in my work as an investigative writer to just make a deal with myself, basically. And, of course, it never came up.
That's a very frank and honorable statement to make, to tell it like that. And it's how...
It didn't feel like it at the time.
No, I know. But hopefully you, looking back on it now, have a different view. This is how they do it. And it's only the people who really have no family at the time of passing that I think would be willing to take on the establishment and let the cat out of the bag. We've seen a few videos like that. I don't know if they're legit. They seem to be. Older gentlemen who are ailing and ill and so forth.
That's right.
Peter, thank you for being here again. We'll talk to you next month when this is available for download worldwide, and we're going to help launch it. You've done something remarkable again. So on behalf of all of your fans, thank you very much, Peter. All right, we'll talk again. You be well.
You bet. Okay, you too, Jeff.
Thank you. All right, that's our program tonight. We'll be right back with you tomorrow night, 21 hours, and do it again. Take care. Thanks for being here. We'll talk soon.